Islam Reform and National Security. This is Alhuriya, son of freedom. Purpose of the study. 1. To determine what doctrinal modifications to Islam would be necessary to remove the threat that Islam poses to national security. 2. To determine whether those doctrinal modifications would be possible to implement. 3. To determine what national security policies to implement in light of the findings of items 1 and 2. Executive summary. My argument is that Islam's imperialism, its militancy, its supremacism, and its worldly ambition are such essential parts of its identity that any hope of transforming it into a harmless, otherworldly religious belief system is unrealistic and prevents the world from seeing that it must be dismantled and from having the resolve to dismantle it. What should a reformed Islam look like? It is found that the version of Islam which would render it harmless would be one which transforms Islam into a mere religion which allows it to peacefully coexist with other world religions, enables Islam to accept the sovereignty of secular states, to accept secular jurisprudence and the rule of secular laws, reconceptualizes Islam as a private faith rather than a political and legal doctrine, employs only persuasion and example as its way of expressing itself in the world. To put it in negative language, the desirable form of Islam would be one in which it renounces jihad in all of its forms, both violent and political, renounces its effort to impose Sharia law on the world, renounces its doctrine of superiority and takes its place among the other world religions, renounces its view of itself as a nation, civilization, political power in the world, and limits itself to functioning as only a religion of private faith, renounces its imperialism, renounces its anti-Semitism. Islam would have to renounce this. Here is an example. Anjem Chowdhury, he says, "You will have no choice. Sharia law is coming to a place near you." Elements of the argument. 1. It is found that Islam contains the undesirable elements threaded deeply throughout its doctrinal structure, such that modifications to its doctrinal structure would be impossible to carry out. 2. It is found that from its beginning Islam has built into itself teachings which make it highly resistant to a softening type of reformation. 3. It is found that because of the supremacist doctrine and therefore attitude of Islam, it is disinclined to make reformation in the interests of world peace. It is found that anti-Semitism is deeply embedded in the doctrines of Islam, that Islam's hatred of Jews is a core element of its identity. 5. It is found that when Islamic actors seek to reform Islam, they seek to restore the glorious medieval history of conquest and especially the explosive military expansion of the earliest years. Any reformation sought by Islamic actors is the wrong kind. 6. Therefore, a reformation in the form of a softening of Islam is not a realistic policy goal. It will be necessary to find other ways to neutralize the violent and aggressive behavior of Islam in the world. 7. Some suggested policies are proposed to neutralize Islam's imperialistic aims. References, abbreviations. RT will stand for Reliance of the Traveler. Q will stand for Quran. Why reformation of Islam is unrealistic. Framing the issue. 1. Imagine you are a statesman somewhere in Europe. Imagine it is October 1st, 1939, and Hitler has just invaded Poland after invading Czechoslovakia 6 months earlier. Your policy advisors tell you that maybe it would be a good idea to install policies to bring about the reformation of National Socialism. These policy advisors point to the peaceful National Socialists in your country whose organizations have civic-sounding names. The peaceful National Socialist organizations in your country are advocating for the transformation of your country into a national socialist state. How likely is it that you will be able to transform Hitler's goals into peaceful ones? Should you focus on reforming National Socialism or defeating it? Framing the issue 2. Imagine you are an American president, Harry Truman. It is April 7th, 1950. Today you are presented with a top-secret document from the National Security Council. It is titled NSC 68. Suppose the thrust of this policy paper had been that, in the light of the threat coming from the Soviet Union, the U.S. should focus on putting in place policies to modify, reform, communist doctrine into a more peaceful ideology. Meanwhile, communist activists in the U.S. are at work advocating for the overthrow of the U.S. government and replacement with a socialist state. What would the U.S. and the world look like today if those had been the actual policy recommendations of NSC 68 and Truman had followed them? There is no appeasing this. Here is another quote by Anjem Choudhury. Contrary to popular misconception, Islam does not mean peace, but rather means submission to the commands of Allah alone. Therefore, Muslims do not believe in the concept of freedom of expression, as their speech and actions are determined by divine revelation and not based on people's desires. What form of Islam would render it harmless? Islam would have to renounce having as its primary goal that of taking the world, lands, peoples, and governments for Allah by kinetic jihad and civilization jihad. Islam would have to renounce its policy of trying to overthrow secular governments and replacing them with an Islamic state ruled by Sharia law. Muslims would have to stop paying to zakat, part of which is used to finance jihad operations around the world. Islam would have to redefine itself from a civilization, nation, political movement, and legal system instead to a mere religion which influences by example and nonviolent preaching only. Islam would have to renounce the use of deception, taqiyya, and propaganda to advance its aims in the world. Disconnect between Islamists and infidels in the meaning of Reformation. When an infidel refers to the Reformation of Islam, he means softening Islam, or making it more compatible with liberal democracy, or reducing it to a private faith only. When an Islamist says Reformation of Islam, he means a return to its glorious past, including conquest, violence, subjugation of populations, and the imposition of Sharia law on peoples, that is, becoming more Islamic. This disconnect allows reform to be used as a tool of deception and discourse, just another opportunity to use taqiyya. Why a rendering of Islam into a private faith only is not possible? My argument. The Quran is believed to be the perfect, eternal, very words of Allah. Islamic doctrine believes it has a divine mandate to demand and then violently impose the Islamic order, Sharia law, on the entire earth, Muslim and infidel alike. It is a this worldly, political, and legal doctrine. Sharia law is threaded throughout the Islamic canonical texts. Sharia law is maintained and enforced by a very conservative community of scholars. The threshold for becoming considered an apostate is set to quash dissent. The Hadith literature has gone through a process of refinement such that it carries a strong presumption of authentication. Islamic leaders have no inclination to consider whether they should ameliorate the militancy of their doctrine. Why a rendering of Islam into a harmless religion is likely to be impossible. The Quran teaches that it comes from an eternal, preserved tablet. This implies that to excise the more violent or militaristic passages from it would be to discard the very words of Allah. This would certainly bring about violent reaction against any who try this. Sharia law is not a standalone document that could be updated for the 21st century. Sharia law is the distillation of hundreds, perhaps thousands of passages from the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sirah, which carry legal requirements of Islam. Compendia like Reliance of the Traveler are merely authorized collections of these passages which have legal force. A reformer would not be able to cherry-pick and then revise the passages out of the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sirah which would cause the desired transformation of Islam. The legal structure of Sharia law is finalized by the scholarly consensus. The scholarly consensus is composed of men who have devoted their lives to the study of Islamic doctrine. They are in a theoretical echo chamber. They are not going to innovate and move their doctrinal system toward a more liberal and open society. They have no motivation to do so. They are confident that their canonical texts are from Allah, that their worldview is correct. There are strong teachings in the Islamic sources that make the threshold for becoming considered an apostate quite low. It does not take much to make yourself considered an apostate and to have a fatwa pronounced against you. The authorized Sahih Hadith literature represents only about 2% of the total Hadiths that have ever existed. There was a period in early Islam in which the creation of the Hadiths was a for-profit industry. Scholars in the early period strenuously culled the Hadiths which they believed were inauthentic. In order for a Hadith to survive exclusion, it had to be able to show a reliable isnad, or chain of tradition. Hadiths are viewed as essential to Islamic theology because they help the Muslim to interpret what might otherwise be cryptic sayings of the Prophet. Because of the refinement process in arriving at the current Hadiths, and because of the importance of Hadiths in understanding the Quran, any attempts to delete imperialistic, warlike, or violent Hadiths would be violently resisted. When you think you have the true truth, and a mandate from the Creator to impose that truth on the world by force of arms, it will be highly unlikely that the West will be able to get you to embrace a more peaceful Islam. 1. Threaded deeply. What are those undesirable elements? Some undesirable elements of Islam: jihad, supremacist attitude, non-Muslims are filth, likened to human excrement, anti-Semitism, abuse of women, aggressive warfare, goal of taking over the world, rejection of secular government, replacement of secular laws with Sharia law, suffocating nature of Sharia law, denial of reason and argument to arrive at societal decisions, the employment of murder to advance its agenda, the sanctioning of slavery and sex slavery. We have known the problem for centuries. Here is a quotation from Voltaire on Islam. Quote, "The Quran teaches fear, hatred, contempt for others, murder as a legitimate means for the dissemination and preservation of this satanic doctrine. It talks ill of women, classifies people into classes, calls for blood and ever more blood. Yet that a camel trader sparks uproar in his tribe, that he wants to make his fellow citizens believe that he talked to the archangel Gabriel, that he boasted about being taken up into heaven and receiving part of that indigestible book there, which can shake common sense on every page, that to gain respect for this work, he covers his country with fire and iron, that he strangles fathers, drags away daughters, that he leaves the beaten of free choice between death and his faith. Now this is certainly something that no one can excuse, unless he came as a Turk into the world, unless superstition has stifled any natural light of reason in him." Unquote. More undesirable elements of Islam: death for homosexuality, death for apostasy, death for adultery, death for criticism or questioning of Islam, that is tyranny, no freedom of speech, no music or art or philosophy. When you have death for apostasy, winning hearts isn't necessary. Here's a quotation from Yusuf al-Qaradawi, head of the Muslim Brotherhood. Quote, "If they had gotten rid of the apostasy punishment, Islam wouldn't exist today. Islam would have ended since the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Opposing apostasy is what kept Islam to this day." End quote. Here's a well-known critic of Islam, Salman Rushdie. He says, "This paranoid Islam, which blames outsider, infidels, for all the ills of Muslim societies, and whose proposed remedy is the closing of those societies to the rival project of modernity, is presently the fastest growing version of Islam in the world." End quote. Here's a list of jihad verses in the Quran. I think there are 164 of them. I'm not going to go over the specific teachings of each one of them or even some of them. My point in showing all these to you is for, number one, for you to look them up and read some of them, and number two, to show you how deeply embedded jihad is in the Quran. So anybody who thinks that they can just excise the passages on jihad from the Quran, it would be essentially impossible because it's so deeply threaded. Jihad in the Hadith. For example, in Sahih Bukhari, it has an entire book entitled the Book of Jihad. And jihad is all over the place in the Hadith literature. 2. Highly resistant. Okay, the Quran's teaching about itself. On Quran 4:127, say, Allah instructs you about legal instruction concerning women and about what is recited unto you in the book. 18:27, and recite what has been revealed to you, O Muhammad, of the book, the Quran of your Lord, that is recited, understand and follow its teachings and act on its orders and preach it to men. None can change his words. 29:51, is it not sufficient for them that we have sent down to you the book, the Quran, which is recited to them? 32:2 and 3, the revelation of the book, this Quran, in which there is no doubt, is from the Lord of the Alameen, that is mankind, jinn, and all that exists. Or say they, he, Muhammad, has fabricated it? Nay, it is the truth from your Lord, so that you may warn a people to whom no warner has come before you, O Muhammad, in order that they may be guided. 62.2, he, Allah, it is who sent among the unlettered ones a messenger, Muhammad, from among themselves, reciting to them his verses, purifying them, and teaching them the book, the Quran. 98.2, a messenger, Muhammad, from Allah, reciting the Quran, purified pages. 3.3 and 4, it is he who has sent down the book, the Quran, to you, Muhammad, with truth, confirming what has come before it. 2.89, and when there came to them, the Jews, a book, this Quran from Allah, confirming what is with them, the Torah and the Gospel. 6.154, then we gave Moses the book, the Torah, to complete our favor upon those who would do right, and explaining all things in detail. 6.157, or lest you, pagan Arabs, should say, if only the book had been sent down to us, we would surely have been better guided than the Jews and the Christians. So now has come unto you a clear proof, the Quran, from your Lord. Who then does more wrong than one who rejects the ayat, the verses of Allah? 35.31, and what we have revealed to you, O Muhammad, of the book, the Quran, it is the very truth that you, Muhammad, and your followers must act on its instructions. 46.30, they said, O people, O our people, verily we have heard a book, this Quran, sent down after Moses, confirming what came before it. It guides to the truth and the straight path. 85.21 and 22, nay, this is a glorious Quran, inscribed in the preserved tablet. 43.4, and verily it, this Quran, is in the mother of the book, with us, indeed exalted, full of wisdom. 52.2 and 3, and by the book inscribed, in parchment unrolled. 97.1, verily we have sent it, this Quran, in the night of decree. Inferences we can draw about the Quran's teaching about itself. The Quran is believed to come from an eternal table, or tablet, which resided in heaven with Allah. The Quran was sent down piecemeal over Muhammad's career. The Quran contains the very words of Allah. None can change its words because its words are the words of Allah. The name, Quran, that is, recitation, suggests a literal transmission of text. The name suggests that there is no room for interpretation. The idea that the Quran purifies its people would suggest that it cannot be altered. The Quran is supposed to be a confirmation of the Torah and the Gospel. It is meant to be understood that it is in the tradition of those two previous sources. But more than that, the Quran presents itself as being the key to the interpretation of the Gospel and the Torah before that. The Quran is described as coming from a preserved tablet, meaning it is an eternal, pre-existing document and not malleable. It is akin to the stone tablets containing the Ten Commandments. Teachings in the Islamic sources warning against innovations or alterations of the text. Reliance of the Traveler, section A 1.3 teaches that the unaided intellect cannot know Allah's commands. This would suggest that philosophical theology is rendered ineffective for knowing Allah. It would also suggest that hermeneutics and philosophical theology cannot be used to alter the plain meaning, the received interpretation of the Quranic text or Muhammad's words in the Hadith literature. Reliance of the Traveler, Book B, is an entire book that teaches that all Muslims must follow the scholarly consensus of Islamic scholars. According to Reliance of the Traveler, B 7.2, when the consensus is reached, a matter becomes law in Islam. It must be understood that the scholars who sit on the boards who make up the mujahids are going to be deemed scholars because they have a track record of being conservative in their interpretations on legal questions. Anyone who changes even one word of the Quran is to be killed, according to these references. Here's an example of Islamic intransigence. You have French manifesto calling to declare obsolete violent Quranic verses sparks fury from Islamic religious establishment, writers in Arab media. This appeared in a paper called Inquiry and Analysis Series. 3. Disinclined to make reformation. The supremacist attitude of Islam. All other religions are cursed by Allah. You can see the references on the screen. Anyone who joins an idol to Allah is to be killed. Anyone who joins a false god to Allah is to be killed. Anyone who invents lies about Allah is to be killed. Supremacism means we don't assimilate. Here's a quote from Erdogan, the president of Turkey. He says Turks should integrate into Germany but not assimilate into their culture. Going on, anyone who denies Allah is to be killed. Anyone who does not accept Muhammad as the prophet of Allah is to be killed. Here's another quote. This comes from Omar Bakri Muhammad. He says, "We don't make a distinction between civilians and non-civilians, innocents and non-innocents, only between Muslims and unbelievers. And the life of an unbeliever has no value, it has no sanctity. Any of the above are to be slain. Christians and Jews are rejected. Muslims are ordered to fight all the peoples of the world until they worship Allah and confess that Muhammad is his prophet. Infidels must not be taken as friends. Infidels are hated and cursed, vile and evildoers. Hostility and hate must exist between the Muslim and the infidel forever until the infidel believes in Allah alone." Passages teaching the supremacist attitude of Islam. Islam does not teach the equality of people and peoples or encourage peaceful coexistence. It teaches the superiority of the Ummah. Muslims are taught to view the infidel as the other. There are more than 400 verses in the Quran alone that describe the torment in hell that Allah has prepared for the infidel. The Quran dehumanizes infidels. They are vile animals and beasts, the worst of creatures and demons. Infidels are perverted transgressors and partners of Satan. You can see the references on the screen. Infidels are to be fought until religion is Allah's alone. Infidels are to be beheaded. Infidels are to be terrorized. Infidels are to be annihilated. Infidels are to be crucified. Infidels are to be punished and expelled. Infidels are to be plotted against by deceit. Believers must be in a constant state of war with the infidel. Here's a quote from Hassan al-Banna. He is the founder in 1928 of the Muslim Brotherhood. Islam is the religion of peace, said David Cameron. Islam is peace, said George W. Bush. Which are you going to believe? And here's the quote from al-Banna. It is the nature of Islam to dominate, not to be dominated, to impose its law on all nations, and to extend its power to the entire planet. How do you reconcile that with what Mr. Cameron and Mr. Bush has just said? The answer is you can't. They were just wrong. 4. Anti-Semitism is deeply embedded. Argument. The anti-Semitism is so deeply embedded in Islamic doctrine and the psyche of Muslims, and in how they are raised, that it is not realistic to think that we can engineer a Semitic neutral Islam. Attacks on Jews. In 2009, there were 374 attacks on Jews in the UK. In 2009, there were 195 attacks on Jews in France. Most attacks on Jews are by Muslims. 39% of Muslim Swedes were found to be anti-Semitic, but only 5% of non-Muslim Swedes were found to be anti-Semitic. There is now a significant emigration from Western and Northern Europe by Jews to the State of Israel as a result of the hostility coming to Jews from Muslims due to an increased numbers of Muslims due to immigration of Muslims to Europe. Okay, this is from an article entitled Hate Crimes Forced Jews Out of Malmo, that's Sweden, Washington Times, March 29, 2010. In 2009, there were 115 bias crimes in Malmo, Sweden. 52 of those bias crimes were against Jews. But there were less than 700 Jews in all of Malmo. So although Jews comprised only 0.25% of Malmo, they suffered 45% of all hate crimes. Rabbi Schneur Kesselman in an interview said, quote, "In the past 5 years I've been here, I think you can count on your hand how many anti-Semitic incidents there have been from the extreme right. In my personal experience, it's 99% Muslim." End quote. Attitudes in some Muslim nations. A Pew study dated August 14, 2005 found that 60% of Turks, 74% of Pakistanis, 76% of Indonesians, 88% of Moroccans, 99% of Lebanese Muslims, 100% of Jordanians, 97% of Egyptians checked somewhat unfavorable or very unfavorable attitudes toward Jews. What do they all have in common, do you suppose? Anti-Semitism in the Quran. 5.82, the Jews are the strongest in enmity to the Muslims. 9.30, the Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah. By the way, this falsely represents the Old Testament teaching. Allah's curse be upon them. 2.65, we said to them, the Jews, be you monkeys, despised and rejected. 3.110, most Jews are disobedient to Allah and rebellious against Allah's command. 2.120, never will the Jews and the Christians be pleased with you, O Muhammad. If you, Muhammad, follow the way of the Christians and Jews, you have no protection against Allah in the day of judgment. 4.47, to Christians and Jews, if you don't believe in Muhammad, we will efface your faces like the backs of necks, without nose, mouth, and eyes, and turn them backwards, and curse them. 4.156 to 159. The Quran accuses Jews of boasting of their killing of Jesus, even though they did not. The Quran accuses the Jews of teaching that Miriam, who confuses with the Miriam of the Old Testament, was guilty of adultery. Quran 4.160 says Muhammad says that he prohibited certain good foods from the Jews as a punishment. 5.41, Jews listen eagerly to lies, they distort teachings. 2.61, the Quran portrays the Jews as disbelievers, transgressors, having killed the prophets wrongfully. 5.51, don't take Jews and Christians as friends. 9.29, fight against those who believe not in Allah who do not forbid what Allah has forbidden, who do not acknowledge the religion of truth among the people of the book. 5.64 The Jews say that Allah is not generous, so let them be accursed. They are in obstinate rebellion and disbelief. We have put enmity and hatred among them until the day of the resurrection. Anti-Semitism in the Hadith. Sahih Bukhari, 5.58.227 During his night journey, Muhammad encounters a tearful Moses who admits that there will be more Muslims than Jews in paradise. Sahih Bukhari 1.12.749 The Jews earn Allah's anger. Sahih Muslim, section 5389 Don't greet Jews before they greet you, and make sure to force them to the narrow part of the road. Sahih Muslim, section 6981 to 85 and Sahih Bukhari 4.56.797 During the final battle in the eschaton, the Jews will hide behind trees and rocks, and these very trees and rocks will say, O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him. Sahih Muslims, section 66, 65 through 68. On the Day of Judgment, Allah will spare some of the Muslims by assigning Jews to hellfire in their place. Anti-Semitism in History. Bat Yor's book, Arabia, recounts how since the 1960s, Islamic actors have been pressuring the European Union to demonize the Jews. And I haven't even spoken about the history of jihad and how Jews have been persecuted during the history of jihad since the founding of Islam. The Muslim nations surrounding Israel have tried to annihilate it in at least 1948, 1967, and 1973. In November 1941, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Hussein, met with Adolf Hitler to discuss, among other things, how to dispose of the Jews in their respective spheres of influence. The present position of the Muslim world toward Israel. The Islamic world wants to annihilate the Jewish state and kill all Jews. The position taken by Islamic actors is that the Jews are stealing Palestine from the Palestinians. Let's back up and look at the history. The Jews were living in the land of Israel in 637 CE, only 5 years after the death of Muhammad, when jihadi fighters seized Jerusalem. This means that Islamic actors stole Jerusalem from the Jews, not vice versa. The existence of the State of Israel is a humiliation to the Islamic world because it defies the Islamic doctrine of Waqf, i.e. the teaching that once jihadis seize land for Allah, it becomes Muslim forever. Not so with Israel. They didn't succeed. Here's an example of anti-Semitism in Islam. Some cartoons. Here's an example of a photograph. This kind of illustrates how Palestinians are trained by their parents to hate Jews and to want the annihilation, to keep the anti-Semitism alive. Question: why hate the Jews? Answer: because the Jews did not accept Muhammad's claim to be the last prophet in a long line of Jewish prophets. The Jews were unconvinced. As a result of the Jews' rejection of Muhammad's claims, Muhammad killed or exiled all Jews from the Arabian Peninsula. In Muhammad's time, the Jews had the audacity to reject Muhammad's claim to be their final prophet. In the present time, the Jews have the audacity to take back their historic lands. So, do you suppose it's possible to engineer a Jew-friendly Islam after all that I've just shown you? The short answer should be no. Anti-Semitism is such a visceral part of the Islamic mind and attitude that it is naive in the extreme to think we can reform Islam to treat Jews as equal members of the human race. The anti-Semitism is so deeply a part of the Islamic mentality that it deserved a separate section. Islam's anti-Semitism alone is prima facie evidence that Islam, the doctrine, deserves to be eradicated from the earth. The doctrines of Islam are a primary obstacle to world peace. 5. Islamic actors want the wrong kind of reformation. On the one hand, we have the reformer who wants to humanize and soften the teachings of Islam to make it more compatible with the modern world, or the West, or the instincts of modern people. I call this the softening reformer. Then we have the reformer who wants to go back to the glorious past of Islam. I call this the hardening reformer. It is clear that the non-Muslim world would prefer to see the outcome of the softening reformer rather than the hardening reformer. Here are two softening reformers. On the left you see Zuhdi Jasser, MD, and on the right you have Imam Muhammad Tawhidi, aka the Imam of Peace. These are both softening reformers. So, as for Zuhdi Jasser, by all accounts Dr. Jasser served the U.S. Navy honorably in his field. In response to 9/11, he and colleagues founded the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He has given congressional testimony. He has been a critic of Muslim Brotherhood front groups operating in the U.S. He has been involved in interfaith activities. His involvement appears to be genuine and not a form of taqiyya. He supports the existence of Israel. He was opposed to the Ground Zero Mosque. He believes that Islamic terrorism is rooted in Islamic ideology. I'd like to make a comment on that as I read it, and that is this distinction between Islamism and Islam. The word Islamism, and I should talk about this in a future video more, the word Islamism is kind of misleading in that it implies or communicates this notion that the real problem is an extreme version of Islam. But that is very misleading, because if you read the canonical text of Islam, it's all there. Islam itself is radical. Islam itself is violent. So to coin a word, Islamism, and make that the boogeyman, and then to treat Islam as this beautiful faith, is just fantasy. So in this, I think he's just wrong. The Imam Muhammad Tawhidi, the Imam of Peace. Imam Tawhidi has posted videos in which he openly rejects portions of the Hadith literature, particularly Sahih Bukhari. He thinks, he's actually suggested, I've seen in a YouTube video where he has suggested that if we just throw away Sahih Bukhari and stick with the Quran, we'll be okay. I think that's very naive. Unless I heard him wrong on the YouTube video that he said that. I'd have to go and revisit that, but if he said that, I think that's just dead wrong, because the Quran itself has plenty of bad stuff in it. He has made the statement that he believes Sahih Bukhari should be deleted from the corpus of Islamic canonical texts. Well, that would be a good start, but it's not enough. He appears to know better than the text of Islam what kind of prophet Muhammad really was. He has a video where he talks about that. He'll say that's not the Muhammad that I love. Well, the problem with saying something like that is that's not the Muhammad that was in the texts. The Muhammad that's in the text is the bad Muhammad, and he's just not facing up to that. The Muhammad that Tawhidi believes in is a peaceful, loving, and harmless world soul. He does not take the Islamic texts at face value. He is against a militant, warlike, imperialistic version of Islam. That's a good thing. He has been vilified by the Islamist community, and here I'm using the word Islamist when I just said I shouldn't, and suffers death threats. So he's being vilified for trying to reform Islam. That's the message that I'm trying to get across here. Here are two men who, and Dr. Jasser has had the same problem. He has been vilified by Muslim Brotherhood organizations in the United States. I don't know if he's had any death threats, but I know that Imam Tawhidi has had death threats. Here's an assessment of these reformers. I have mixed feelings about these two modernizing Islamic reformers. On the one hand, I do believe that they are sincere and not engaging in taqiyya. Both of them seem to want a version of Islam that is apolitical and peaceful. Both of them suffer criticism from Islamic organizations. On the other hand, both of them practice a form of Islam that is not supported by the Islamic texts. Their Islam is a humanized form of Islam. However, as long as the canonical literature of Islam cuts across their views, it would be difficult for them to gain a following of the majority of Muslims, even in their countries of residence, the U.S. for Jasser and Australia for Tawhidi. There is also a risk of placing too much hope in these reformers. For the purposes of national security, you must ask yourself the question, how likely would it be to persuade the majority of Muslims to migrate their doctrinal system over to a version of Islam embodied by the likes of Jasser and Tawhidi? The answer is that while we are waiting for the reformation they are advocating, we must face the existential threat posed by actors like Islamic State and the Muslim Brotherhood. Actors like Islamic State and the Muslim Brotherhood are faithful to canonical Islam. It is the doctrine that is so dangerous. Militant Muslims are obedient to the canonical texts. They are likely to view Jasser and Tawhidi as advocating a pie-in-the-sky version of Islam, of a product of their peaceful hopes, of fantasy Islam, and they would be correct. As laudable as these reformers' efforts are, in the end, the threat comes from the doctrines of Islam. The imperialism, the violence, the supremacism of Islam are deeply embedded in the canonical texts of Islam. Until those texts are changed and deleted, and Islam, the doctrinal system, is rendered harmless, we will continue to suffer the threat. I would respectfully ask both of them why they are still Muslims, if they reject so many of Islam's central teachings. At what point do you finally throw up your hands and say, I can't support this doctrine anymore? The danger from these peace-loving souls is that their idealism will distract us from the urgent need to face down the threat that the doctrine poses to the world. Softening of Islam is not realistic. Here's an example. How likely are we going to reform this viewpoint? Here is President Erdogan of Turkey. He says the term moderate Islam is ugly and offensive. There is no moderate Islam. Islam is Islam. And he's right. He's right. And the leftists who tell us otherwise are deceiving us. Is the West listening? Here is Mr. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He is a leader of ISIS, or he was the leader of ISIS. He said, Islam was never a religion of peace. Islam is a religion of fighting. No one should believe that the war that we are waging is the war of the Islamic State. It is the war of all Muslims, but the Islamic State is spearheading it. It is the war of Muslims against the infidels. Here is a warfighter telling us the truth about his doctrine, and we are ignoring him. And the most obscene manifestation of that is the countering violent extremism doctrine that was forced on the U.S. government from above, and such that analysts and warfighters were having to go along with that separation of Islam, the doctrine, from the terrorist acts. A softening reform of Islam is a dangerous fantasy. It is dangerous because it distracts us from facing Islam's true intentions, as known from its own words. We have to listen to what they are saying. They really aren't lying to us when they make these statements, although there is taqiyya, and that'll have to be another study. So let's go to recommended national security policy. So now I'm going to step through a couple of dozen recommendations that I have for national security policy. Because Islam, as a matter of historical fact, has been practiced with political and legal doctrines integral to it, which are not severable from the religious doctrine, and it has behaved like an empire, it should be reclassified in law as a political and legal doctrine containing religious aspects and declassified as a religion proper. It will help us very greatly in any of the Western countries if Islam is reclassified as a political doctrine and declassified as a religion proper. That would give us a lot more leverage to handle the problems that it poses. Because a true obedient Muslim has as his first political and legal fealty to Islam, Sharia law, and the Ummah, Muslims, now understood as a nation, not a race or religion, should be barred from immigration and naturalization. The only Muslims who might possibly be allowed to immigrate and naturalize should be apostate Muslims, as they are under a death sentence according to Sharia law. Even then, careful vetting should be in order. Any naturalized Muslim who advocates for the replacement of the U.S. Constitution, federal and state laws, by Sharia law, whether by violent means or not, should be prosecuted for perjury of his oath of citizenship. They should be denaturalized under Title 8 U.S.C. 1451A and deported for concealment of relevant facts during their naturalization. Any Muslim who advocates for a violent jihad should be prosecuted under Title 18 U.S.C. Section 2384, sedition. If that Muslim is a naturalized citizen, he should be denaturalized and deported upon serving his sentence for violation of Title 8 U.S.C. 1451A, concealment. Any Muslim who is not a citizen who advocates for the installation of Sharia regulations should be immediately deported. By their own hands, from the explanatory memorandum, Holy Land Foundation, Trial 2008. And that is illustrated by this statement by President Erdogan of Turkey. He says, democracy is like a train. You take it to where you have to go and then you get off. Okay, more recommendations. All Muslim Brotherhood front groups should be outlawed and designated subversive groups. Any Muslim who is found to be a member of such groups should be prosecuted for treason. And we're not doing that. And we should. Write your congressman or your senator and urge them to pass laws to this effect. Any Muslim who is not a citizen who joins a Muslim Brotherhood front group should be automatically deported. A starting place for defining a designated Muslim Brotherhood front group should be those that are listed in the explanatory memorandum published 5/22/1991 and entered into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation Trial 2008. To that list, at very least, should be added CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, as court proceedings found that CAIR was DBA for Hamas. It doesn't get simpler than that. Any Muslim who gives to zakat should be prosecuted for material support of terrorism, since part of zakat goes to support worldwide jihad operations. When are we going to face up to that? Money from member states of the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, should be barred from entry into the country. This especially includes money used to build mosques, madrasas, and to create endowed chairs of Islamic studies or Islamic studies departments in colleges and universities, which are used as centers for Islamic propaganda. We are letting the OIC and Saudi Arabia propagandize us by pouring money into the creation of these places. The U.S. should phase out the purchase of oil from any OIC country. The U.S. should embark on a crash 10-year program to phase out gasoline-powered cars and replacement by electric cars or fuel cell cars. The U.S. should put in place policies to better promote a massive increase in the use of solar PV, solar thermal technology, wind energy, and passive solar architectural design. The uncoupling of terrorism from Islamic doctrine, which was enforced in the Obama administration's Countering Violent Extremism program, in which certain words were scrubbed out of the official documents, should be revoked, and the original version of those documents should be reinstated. Mosques and madrasas should be monitored for teaching of violent or nonviolent overthrow of the Constitution and laws of the U.S. or of the states. Any violating mosque or madrasa should be closed, and the offending imams should be denaturalized if a citizen, and whether a citizen or not, prosecuted for sedition. All known jihadi training camps should be dismantled, and the jihadi trainees and instructors prosecuted for sedition. The property should be forfeited. Any U.S. citizen who joins a known terrorist organization should be prosecuted for treason. Laws should be put in place to protect the U.S. and the states from the incremental introduction of Sharia regulations and laws. Laws should be put in place to further protect the First Amendment from the gradual erosion coming from various pathways originating from Sharia blasphemy law or the Islamic law of slander. There are currently court cases in which attempts are being made to chip away at the First Amendment. This must be kept under a microscope. All known Muslim Brotherhood influence operators employed as appointees or contractors to the federal government should be rooted out, and if not a naturalized citizen, deported. If a naturalized citizen, denaturalized and deported, or if a non-naturalized citizen, prosecuted for treason. Education programs should be created to educate American adults and children as to the corrosive nature of Islamic doctrine. now reclassified as a political and legal doctrine. It should become a goal for every American to have enough knowledge of Islam to be able to refute it on their feet in any public situation. The country must be inoculated from any foothold from Islamic taqiyya. It should be U.S. policy to no longer provide grants to OIC member states. It should be U.S. policy to no longer sell arms to OIC member states. Scholarship should be established at the MA and PhD levels in Islamic studies and related disciplines to critique and discredit Islamic ideology. Scholarship should especially be in fields in which the student can critique the internal consistency of Islamic doctrine or the historical origins of the Quran or the Islamic tradition in an effort to neutralize them on an ideological level. Think tanks functioning as ideological warfare centers should be established to produce media and propaganda materials to be beamed by satellite, internet, and shortwave into the Islamic world to weaken Islamists' resolve to wage jihad and to encourage apostasy by Muslims. Scholarship should be put in place for supporting MA and PhD theses which strengthen the nation's understanding of and devotion to liberal democracy and being able to defend it against Islam and cultural Marxism. Any endowed chair or Islamic Studies department should be barred from receiving monies from foreign sources. Foreign countries, in particular Saudi Arabia, should be barred from funding these centers of propaganda. Are you paying attention? Here is a quote from Muammar Gaddafi. He said this: "We have 50 million Muslims in Europe. There are signs that Allah will grant Islam victory in Europe without swords, without guns, without conquest. We'll turn it into a Muslim continent within a few decades." Will Europe let this become that? This is Aben Alhuriya, son of freedom.